We've all been there. You spend all this time carefully measuring a piece of wood for your project. You bring it over to your miter saw, line it up perfectly with your pencil mark, and make the cut. Then you take it to your workbench, check it with a square, and it's not a perfect 90-degree angle. The gap, however small, is kind of mocking you. Your first instinct is probably to blame the blade. You might think, this cheap blade is warped, or I must have dulled it. It's an easy and common conclusion to jump to, and, honestly, a lot of us immediately start shopping online for a brand new, expensive Diablo or Forest blade, convinced it will solve all our problems. But hold on a second. Before you spend your hard-earned cash on a new blade, let's talk about what's really going on. While a high-quality blade absolutely gives you a cleaner, smoother cut with less tear out, it isn't the magic bullet for accuracy. The blade's job is to cut a straight line where you tell it to. The accuracy of the angle, whether it's 90 degrees or 45 degrees, is determined by the saw's setup and alignment. A brand new top-of-the-line blade on a poorly aligned saw will just give you a very clean, very smooth, very angle. It's kind of like putting expensive racing tires on a car with a crooked steering wheel. Think of it this way, the blade spins in a single plane. The miter saw's job is to guide that spinning blade through the wood at a precise angle. The two main parts that control this are the miter adjustment, for angled cuts, and the fence, for positioning the wood. If the fence, which is your primary reference surface for a straight cut, isn't perfectly perpendicular to the blade's path, your cut will never be square. You could have a blade made of pure diamond, and it would still produce an out-of-square cut if the fence is leading it astray. It's a classic case of mistaken identity, where the innocent blade takes all the heat. So, let's stop blaming the blade for a moment. It's working hard, doing its best to spin and cut. The real issue, 9 times out of 10, is a simple matter of alignment. The good news is that this is something you can usually fix yourself in about 15 minutes with a tool you already have in your shop. It doesn't require any fancy, expensive jigs or a degree in engineering. It just requires a little bit of patience and knowing where to look. By learning to tune up your own tools, you gain a deeper understanding of how they work, and you save money. That's a win-win in my book. So, if the blade isn't the problem, what is? Let's turn our attention to the miter saw fence. This is the tall, flat surface that you press your wood against before you make a cut. Its one and only job is to be a stable, reliable reference that is exactly 90 degrees to the path of the saw blade when the saw is set to a 0-degree miter. If it does that job perfectly, you get perfect 90-degree cuts. But if it's off by even a fraction of a degree, every single crosscut you make will be slightly off, leading to those frustrating gaps in your projects. It's the unsung hero, or the secret villain, of your miter saw. How does a fence lose its alignment? It can happen for a bunch of reasons. Sometimes saws come from the factory with less than perfect alignment. The manufacturer assembles it to be close enough, but close enough isn't good enough for fine woodworking. More often the saw gets knocked around during shipping. All those bumps and vibrations can easily shift the fence out of square. Even in your own shop, just the regular vibration from the saw's motor running over months or years can slowly cause the bolts holding the fence to loosen and shift. Moving the saw from a job site back to your shop can also do it. It doesn't take much to throw it off. The fence is typically made of 2 separate pieces, one on the left and one on the right of the blade. It's critical that both of these pieces are aligned not only to the blade but also to each other. They need to be coplanar, which is just a fancy way of saying they need to form a single, flat, continuous line. If one side is slightly forward or backward compared to the other, it will cause problems, especially when you're cutting longer boards. A long board might rest against one side correctly, but then pivot slightly as it makes contact with the other misaligned side, ruining your cut angle. Another important relationship is between the fence and the table of the saw. The fence must be perfectly perpendicular to the saw's table. If it leans forward or backward, even slightly, it can affect the squareness of your cut, especially on thicker pieces of wood. You want your workpiece held securely at a perfect 90-degree angle to the table, and the fence is what ensures that happens. So, we're not just checking one alignment, We're making sure the fence is square to the blade's path, that both halves are aligned with each other, and that the fence face is perpendicular to the table. All right, enough talk. Let's get out in the shop and figure out if your fence is actually the problem. This is a simple test, and all you need is a good, reliable square. A combination square or a small engineer's square is perfect for this. Don't use a big framing square that's been banged around a construction site, as it might not be truly square itself. You need to trust your measuring tool. Before you start, make sure the saw is unplugged. We're not making any cuts right now, and you should never have your hands near the blade when the saw has power. Safety first, always. First, set your saw's miter angle to exactly 0 degrees. You should feel it click into the detent, or the positive stop, for 0. Now, lower the blade all the way down. You don't need to force it, just bring it down into the cutting position. Take your trusty square and place its base firmly against the face of the fence on one side of the blade. Slide the square over until the ruler part of it touches the side of the saw blade itself. Be careful to place it against the flat plate of the blade, not against one of the carbide teeth, as the teeth stick out slightly and will give you a false reading. Now, look closely at the connection between your square and the saw blade. Is there a gap? Shine a flashlight behind it if you need to see better. If the square sits perfectly flat against both the fence and the blade plate, with no light peeking through, then congratulations, that side of your fence is perfectly aligned. If you see a small wedge-shaped gap at either the front or the back of the blade, your fence is out of alignment. A tiny gap might not seem like a big deal, but over the width of a 12-inch board, that tiny angle becomes a very noticeable error. Don't stop there. You have to repeat the exact same process for the other side of the fence. Just because the left side is perfect doesn't mean the right side is. Slide your square over to the other fence section and check it against the blade in the same way. Both sides need to be perfectly 90 degrees to the blade. This is the crucial test that will tell you for sure if your fence is the source of your cutting woes. If you find a gap on either side, don't worry. In the next sections, we'll walk through how to fix it. It's easier than you think. Before you grab a wrench and start loosening bolts, there's one critical step that most people skip. You have to clean your saw. I know, it's not the most exciting part of woodworking, but it is absolutely essential for getting an accurate alignment. Your miter saw creates a ton of sawdust, and that dust gets everywhere. It gets packed into every nook and cranny, especially around the base of the fence and in the tracks where the miter adjustment happens. If you try to adjust your fence with all that gunk in the way, you're just setting yourself up for failure. Think about it. If there's a small pile of compacted sawdust between the fence and the table it bolts to, you can't get a true reading with your square. You might adjust the fence to be perfectly square, but it's square relative to that little mountain of dust. As soon as you make a cut, the vibration can shift or dislodge the dust, and your fence will move right back out of alignment. You'll be chasing your tail, constantly readjusting, all because of a little bit of debris. This is probably the most common mistake people make when trying to tune up their tools. So, grab a brush, a shop vac with a nozzle attachment, and maybe a can of compressed air. With the saw still unplugged, give it a thorough cleaning. Pay special attention to the area where the fence meets the saw's table. Loosen the fence bolts just a little bit, not enough to let the fence flop around, but just enough to create a tiny gap. Use a thin piece of plastic or a pick to scrape out any impacted sawdust from underneath. Then use your vacuum and compressed air to blow out and suck up all the loose particles. You want that metal-on-metal contact to be perfectly clean. Don't forget to clean the face of the fence itself, as well as the saw's table. Sometimes little bits of sap or resin can build up on these surfaces. This can prevent your workpiece from sitting perfectly flat against the fence and table, which also ruins the accuracy of your cut. A little bit of mineral spirits on a rag can help dissolve any sticky residue. A clean tool is a happy tool, but more importantly, a clean tool is an accurate tool. Taking 5 minutes to do this now will save you hours of frustration down the road. It's the foundation of a good tune-up. Now that your saw is sparkling clean, we can get to the main event. Adjusting the fence. The process is pretty straightforward. Most miter saw fences are held in place by 2 or 4 bolts. You'll find these bolts either on the face of the fence, the top, or sometimes on the back. You'll need the correct wrench or Allen key to loosen them. With the saw unplugged and the blade down, loosen the bolts on one side of the fence just enough so you can gently tap the fence to move it. You don't want it to be sloppy and loose. You just want to be able to make very small adjustments. With the bolts slightly loose, place your square back against the fence face and the saw blade plate, just like you did during the inspection. Now gently tap the front or back of the fence with a small wooden block or the plastic handle of a screwdriver. Watch the gap between the square and the blade. Your goal is to close that gap completely. Tap, check, tap, check. Make tiny movements until the square sits perfectly flush with no light showing through. This part requires a bit of patience. Rushing it will only lead to overcorrecting and frustration. Once you have it perfect, it's time to tighten the bolts back down. Here's a pro tip: tighten them in an alternating pattern, like you would the lug nuts on a car tire. Tighten one bolt a little bit, then the one farthest from it, and so on. This helps prevent the fence from shifting as you apply pressure. As you tighten them, keep your square in place and watch to make sure nothing moves. Sometimes, the act of tightening can pull the fence slightly out of alignment. If it moves, loosen the bolts again and make a tiny compensating adjustment before retightening. After you've adjusted and tightened one side, repeat the exact same process for the other side of the fence. Each side is adjusted independently. Once both are locked down and you've double-checked that they are perfectly square to the blade, you need to do one final test. This is the 5-cut test, a classic woodworking technique. Take a scrap piece of wide board, make a cut, rotate the board, and cut off a thin slice. Do this 5 times. The 5th piece will magnify any error by a factor of 10. If the 5th offcut has a perfectly uniform thickness from end to end, your saw is dead-on accurate. There you have it. You've gone from having frustrating, gappy joints to making perfect, crisp, 90-degree cuts. And you did it without spending a dime on a new blade or, even worse, a whole new saw. You took the time to understand how your tool works, you identified the real problem, and you fixed it yourself. This is a huge step in your journey as a woodworker. The ability to tune and maintain your own equipment is just as important as knowing how to use it. It empowers you to get the absolute best performance out of the tools you already own. This principle doesn't just apply to miter saws. Your table saw fence needs to be aligned with the blade. Your drill press table needs to be square to the chuck. Your jointer fences and tables need to be perfectly set up. Every tool in your shop has adjustments that can and will drift over time. Instead of seeing this as a flaw, see it as an opportunity. Every tune-up is a chance to connect with your tools and demand precision from them. You'll find that a well-tuned, inexpensive saw will often outperform an expensive, top-of-the-line saw straight out of the box. Make checking your miter saw fence a regular part of your shop routine. You don't have to do it every day, but it's a good idea to check it every few weeks, and always after moving the saw or completing a big project that involved a lot of vibration. It only takes a minute to throw a square on it and check. That 1 minute can save you from wasting expensive hardwood and hours of frustration on a project down the line. Keep your tools clean, keep them tuned, and they will serve you well for years to come. So, the next time a project doesn't come out quite right, resist the urge to immediately blame your blades or your own skills. Take a step back and look at your tools with a critical eye. More often than not, a simple adjustment is all that stands between you and woodworking perfection. There's a tremendous amount of satisfaction that comes from taking a machine and making it better. You're not just a mere mortal using a tool. You're a craftsperson who understands the machine, and that knowledge will make everything you build just that much better.